Forspoken contains a lot of things that, on paper, make it easy to love. Flashy action, parkour, badass matriarchal rulers, cats, nail art. Yet Forspoken is let down by an abject unwillingness to break the mold. It's a game that exactly captures every generic stereotype of gaming over the last 10 to 15 years. It is an open-world RPG where protagonist Frey Holland is whisked away from her New York home and finds herself in a world of magic and fantasy, where her new superpowers make her the only person able to defeat a world-ending threat. This pedestrian premise never goes anywhere particularly exciting, and its twists and turns feel more like the turns you find in a Roman road. Game stories don't always have to throw Bioshock or Nier Automata levels of clever plot twists at you, but they should at least be, on a base level, interesting. No, I'm being too harsh. The latter half of Forspoken's narrative is decent enough, Stockholm Syndrome or nay. Once the game stops focusing on the Frey from New York and more on the Frey from the land of Athia, it becomes more enjoyable, in what may perhaps be a controversial twist, despite the infamously cringeworthy trailer that showcased some toe-curling dialogue. Forspoken isn't filled with that many moments that made me recoil in secondhand embarrassment. The dialogue from the trailer, which comes from a very unnatural early cutscene, is by far the worst offender. The rest of the dialogue isn't that bad. If you imagine some twisted version of the quips characters like Ratchet or Nathan Drake come out with, mixed with the strange and, again, highly unnatural dialogue that peppers Square Enix franchises like Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy, you should be generally prepared for this game. The most fun I had with Forspoken was when I ignored the story and just explored. Combat and movement, even though imperfect, is the best thing about the game. Forspoken's magic covers the four basic elements: earth, wind and fire, and water, with both support and damage spells available. It's fun, and it melds with the parkour really well. The problem is that it holds back on giving you access to its full toolkit until the very end of the game. Forspoken would be a lot better if it took where you end up 25 hours in and gave it to you about 15 hours earlier. You don't get your final set of spells until just before the final boss, which feels like a massive oversight to me. It all makes sense within the narrative, but it feels horrible for keeping the game engaging across its full run. Enemies are interesting enough, with some being weak to certain elements and status effects, but when they're not sprinkled around the world, they're plonked in rather bland, repeatable dungeons or fortresses. Frey can take on increasingly difficult enemies using new cloaks, necklaces, and nails, which increase damage and other stats. New ones can be picked up at a variety of Ubisoft-style pit stops chucked around the map. These stops are very samey and rarely challenging. You run down a corridor into some enemies, rinse and repeat. The mutants are the best enemies I found in the game. They are stronger and give you more of an opportunity to practice evade timings and attack patterns, at least when I could figure out what was going on between stutters. Speaking of which, it was a mission to get this to run on PC. My PC is pretty well spec'd other than a lack of RAM, but combine that with the bizarre system requirements and it results in severe frame drops every single time I entered combat. The game put me on standard graphics settings by default, but on those settings I could barely pull anything higher than 12 FPS during combat or when in the main capital city. In fact, a significant early portion of my 32-hour playthrough was spent tirelessly tinkering with settings like some kind of Linux user. Forspoken's PC port is horrifically optimized, and it felt like nothing I did was making it run better. There are some pretty severe texture and model rendering issues, made even worse when attempting to play the game at 1440p, that has become my standard resolution. Despite not loving all of the open-world filler, I became enamored with finding the world's cats. The original version of this review was written by Molly Taylor, who's very big on cats. She comments that the only part of Forspoken's story that tugged at her heartstrings is one that also centers around a cat. Forspoken could have been so much more. Too much of the gameplay feels like an objective collectathon, a way to distract you between point A and point B, hoping you don't notice that there's nothing to actually do. The biggest mistake I made was doing so much of my exploration early on. If you're thinking of playing the game, despite it being one I don't even recommend picking up on sale, just blitz through the story before you do anything else. The real enjoyment comes once you're in the post-game with Frey's full arsenal at your disposal. Forspoken is a game that is at its most fun when you're not following its orders. Once the shackles of its weak narrative come off, it finally feels like you're playing the game Forspoken is trying to be. Don't get me wrong, freedom can't cover up vapid gameplay objectives, but maybe it helps. I shouldn't have to recommend beating a game just as a starting point to have fun with it, but with Forspoken, that's exactly what I'm doing.